what your country can do for you.
The white man is the oppressor.
Well, I'm not a clown.
I am the greatest.
I am somebody.
Read my lips.
I have a dream.
Planes left Iranian airspace.
Overcome. The best is yet to come.
Good evening, I'm Ron Reagan. President John F. Kennedy used to say everyone could remember where they were when they heard the news of Pearl Harbor and the death of Franklin Roosevelt. In this half of the 20th century, it is the news of his assassination, of course, that has us all frozen somewhere back in our life, trying to grasp news that was simply too large and too bad to absorb, and still is in many ways. The death of John F. Kennedy doesn't go away. The murder resists solution. The memory won't fade, and the implications seem to grow more and more devastating even today, 28 years after the fact. We seem no closer to acceptance or understanding, but the assault continues. Norman Mailer has a fat new novel that tries to put Kennedy and the CIA in some sort of context. Oliver Stone's new movie is about the New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison and the one single criminal prosecution in connection with the case. There's a movie about Jack Ruby, a miniseries on Jackie Kennedy, a 5-part cable show called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And staring up at you from every newsstand in the country, the current issue of Esquire with a cover story on JFK. The man, the movie, the murder mystery. With us tonight, Robert Sam Anson wrote that cover story for Esquire magazine. He wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination in 1975 as well. David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, got the case into the New York Times bestseller list, and his theories on what happened to JFK's corpse after the assassination have broken important new ground. Carl Oglesby is head of the Assassination Information Bureau in Boston, and Carl is an expert on the political aspects of JFK's death. Robert Groden was the chief consultant for a recent British TV series called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. He's a professional photo analyst who's made much of the photographic evidence on the assassination. He's made it public, that is, or at least available to the public. Welcome to you all. Thank you all for being here. David, this is your book, Best Evidence, and Robert, high treason from you, and that takes care of the book plugs for the evening. All right, let's start with the event itself and sort of move out concentrically. It is about 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. We're in Dallas, Texas. The president has just made a rather odd little bend in his motorcade route. He enters Dealey Plaza and shots are fired. Fortunately, there's a lot of photographic and film evidence as well as eyewitness accounts. What does that evidence tell us happened? How many shots? Who was firing? That sort of thing.
We've been fighting about that ever since it happened. If only there had been a few more photographs, a few more films, maybe we could have pinned it down. If only there had been an autopsy in Dallas instead of the removal of the body under certain peculiar circumstances to Washington. But the fact is that for all the eyewitnesses, for all the photographic and other kinds of evidence, it's still a mystery as to what happens. Of course, the government says that there were 3 shots fired, one of them missed. One of them hit both the president and Governor Connally, the so-called single bullet or magic bullet theory. And then a 3rd shot hit Kennedy in the head and clearly was fatal.
Mm-hmm. Look, it's the central thesis of my book and central to what I think happened, that President Kennedy's body was secretly altered between the time of the shooting at 12:30 and the time of the autopsy.
Okay.
And it's the alterations that have confused the issue and prevented us from knowing the truth and make Oswald look guilty.
Okay, I want to get to the autopsy in a bit, but let's stay in Dealey Plaza just for the moment. Robert, you've made a great study of the Zapruder film, the Abraham Zapruder film, which many of us have seen, and unfortunately was too expensive for us to get a hold of for the show. What does that seem to demonstrate about the number of shots?
Well, the Zapruder film is, in fact, a clock for the assassination. It creates what I like to refer to as salami slices of time. You can tell what happens from the evaluation of the film, each frame running about an 1/18 of a second from the one before or after it. And given the responses of both men and aligning the film with the acoustics tape that was made quite by accident by the Dallas Police Department, you end up with a relatively accurate scenario of the events. That is that more than one person was firing, because the Zapruder film also shows us the spaces between the shots. And because of that, we know that the capability of Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle was not fast enough to have fired the shots that quickly. There had to be at least a second assassin, based on the photographic evidence alone.
There is also a lot of eyewitness testimony. Do you find it compelling?
The eyewitness testimony that was presented to the Warren Commission, two-thirds of the witnesses said that the fatal shot that killed the president came from the direction of the grassy knoll, the so-called grassy knoll, in front of him. Where the Warren Commission, the government explanation is that all the shots came from behind the president. The catch of having shots in front of the president, we know that there were some shots from behind as well, so you have ipso facto two gunmen or a conspiracy. Part of a difficulty with Dealey Plaza is that eyewitness testimony is not the most reliable thing in the world. People get emotionally charged, especially during an incident like that one. So you're looking for what is the best evidence and what is the most cold-blooded kind of evidence. We have lots of photographs. Clearly, this is the most photographed assassination ever. One of the most photographed news events.
One of the photographs is by a woman named Mary Moorman, and much has been made of that photograph, blown up, enhanced, what have you, that purports to show, and I'm not an expert, so I don't know, purports to show a man with a rifle. He appears to be wearing something like a police uniform at the top of the knoll. It appears to have been taken at the instant that he fired.
It was taken within a 1/6 of a second of the shooting. Right now it is being analyzed outside of the country. We've tried to have it analyzed within the United States, and every time someone's gotten close to finishing an analysis, they get afraid of it. They run away from it, refuse to give a report, return the originals, and that's it. Whether the gentleman who appears to be in the photograph is really there or whether it's light or shadow, it's still, after 28 years, too soon to say. The evolution of computer analysis of photographs is now reaching a point where we may be able to do something with it.
Maybe one of the problems, there's a tendency to get too hung up in what happened in Dealey Plaza, to spend too much time speculating on how many gunmen were there, what kind of weapons were they using, when were the shots fired. The fact of the matter is...
We're only spending one segment on it.
The fact of the matter is that the evidence that there was more than one gunman is overwhelming. And I think that you've got to get beyond the realm of Dealey Plaza to find out what was the motivation.
We're heading that way. I just want to mention one more thing before we go to a break, and that's the evidence that seems to be suggested by physics. If you watch the Zapruder film, at the instant the president is hit in the head, his head snaps backward.
Well, that's where my starting off point was in this whole case. Back in 1965, the 26 volumes were available. We did not have the Zapruder film in color or in motion, and when you look on the page of those volumes, and of course it's the same thing is true in the film itself, the head after the fatal shot goes back violently and to the left. And I don't see how it's possible to argue that the president can be propelled backwards by a shot from behind.
Okay.
That was
The
my
calculated rate of acceleration, by the way, was 100.3 feet per second. Far faster than a neuromuscular reaction. The excuse that the so-called other side presents all the time is the car was accelerating. Well, in fact, it was decelerating. You can see from the Nix film from the other side of the street that the motorcycle policeman actually almost overtake it. The car is slowing down, so that's not an excuse.
Okay, we have to take a break now, but when we return, we'll deal with the question of Lee Harvey Oswald in a minute.
Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
We're back discussing the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The Warren Commission, of course, blames Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a lone gunman, a fanatic, what have you. He's a somewhat mysterious figure. What do we know about him?
We wouldn't know much about him from reading the Warren Commission report. The Warren Commission alleged that Oswald shot and killed the president acting alone with no outside encouragement or assistance. According to the Warren Commission, he was a deranged stock boy who wanted to make a name for himself. The fact of the matter is that there has been convincing testimony both before the Warren Commission and since that the buffs have dug up that Lee Oswald had enjoyed extensive ties to U.S. intelligence. From the time he was in the Marine Corps, which assigned him to a top-secret CIA base in the Far East, to his so-called defection to the Soviet Union, which was, what, 59?
No.
to his return to the United States, he's been in and out of the company of people who clearly have, not organized, but clearly have intelligence fingerprints all over them.
That sound good to you guys?
Yes, it's very important also to know about Oswald that there was a concerted effort starting already in 1960 to double him. There are at least half a dozen well-documented instances on the record, starting the earliest in 1960 when he's in the Soviet Union, presumably a defector, in which somebody who could not possibly have been Lee Harvey Oswald was calling himself Lee Harvey Oswald. And these incidences come right up to a few days before the assassination. So this guy is a very mysterious figure. He is not by any means the solitary, reclusive nut that the Warren Commission wanted us to think he was. And the peculiar thing beyond this is that the Warren Commission very well had this information available to it, very well knew that this was not a lone nut. This was a guy with important connections to the intelligence world.
Indeed, he had a higher security clearance than his own commanding officer when he was stationed at Atsugi Air Base in Japan. And he had a great deal of knowledge of the U-2 spy flights. And this is what he was purporting to give to the Soviets when he defected. So this was not some dumb lone nut dropout as we're presented with.
It should be, I think, noted as well that this is not something that the buffs, the assassination buffs, have dreamed up. If you take a look at the declassified transcripts of the Warren Commission's executive sessions, they were just as worried as the people who were sitting here are that Lee Oswald had connections to American intelligence. They were very, very bothered by what he was up to in the Soviet Union, by the fact that he returned from the Soviet Union after his so-called defection. And this was at a time when the CIA was interviewing tourists coming home from Yugoslavia, and with this fellow who had offered to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviets, just passed blissfully back into his country with no problem whatsoever. I mean, there are lots of those things in the background.
One thing he doesn't seem to have been is a particularly good marksman, if I'm reading the research correctly, although that was central to the Warren Commission's thesis, that he was actually an expert marksman.
Nelson Delgado said that when he was at the rifle range, they would run up the red flag because he'd missed the target completely. They call that Maggie's drawers. And he got a lot of Maggie's drawers.
The red flag was going up a lot.
Something like that, yeah.
The Warren Commission made so much of the fact that he was classified as a marksman. Marksman is the lowest acceptable classification you can get than sharpshooter and expert. Just barely making marksman doesn't make you a good shot. When I was in the service, there were a lot of people that could not score very well, and just to get the day over with, they would give them marksman status.
And the fact is, you know, a lot of experts have tried to duplicate Oswald's alleged feat of getting 2 shots on a moving target at the range of about a football field's distance, and nobody has ever been able to do it, even against stationary targets.
He was firing a rather outmoded gun.
Absolutely.
Mannlicher carbine, I believe it was, a single shot.
It was an Italian Army weapon, and the Italians who used it during World War II called it the humanitarian rifle.
Because you couldn't kill anybody with it on purpose.
It was never known to hurt anyone on purpose.
Well, was Oswald a patsy, as he at one point claimed in a interview sort of passing through the Dallas police
I
station?
believe he's a complete patsy. And that means I believe that if you sat down with him for a cup of coffee on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, and if we could get into a time machine and speak to him and find out, he would have a story to explain his impressions of who he was and what he's doing in that building. And I believe that when he put his head on the pillow on the night of November 21st, he hasn't the faintest idea that President Kennedy is going to get shot at or anything like that on November 22nd. So clearly in Oswald's life there's some force, some story he's believing that permits him to be moved around in the 18 months before the shooting to all these different cities. He has post office boxes. He makes a trip out of the country to Mexico. He never wants to give his brother his address. Things of that sort are going on.
There were certain timing problems with his whereabouts on the day. 90 seconds after the shooting, estimate by a police officer who ran into the book depository building, encountered Oswald sipping a Coke on the 2nd floor.
That is a very serious incident because the officer runs into the building. If you see films of it, he dismounts, runs right into the building, and he wants to go upstairs. But between the 2nd and the 3rd floor, he's no longer following the building manager who's leading him upstairs. And the building manager comes back to the 2nd floor landing, and there's Oswald at the Coke, inside a room with a Coke in his hand, and the officer has his gun out up against his stomach. And the line I use in lectures is, what was the officer supposed to say? Drop the Coke or I'll shoot? I mean, the bottom line is that within 90 seconds of the shooting at most, and possibly within 20 seconds of the shooting, a man who could have shot Lee Harvey Oswald ended up being his alibi witness for all of those of us who believe he's innocent. He places him definitively on the second floor of the building. All right, when we return, we'll deal with some of the very curious goings-on around the autopsy of John F. Kennedy when we come back. We're back with our discussion of the JFK assassination. All right, the shooting has happened. JFK is now taken to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. He has a massive head wound. He has a wound in his throat, perhaps a wound in his back. What do the doctors that first get to him see? What do they describe? They describe a wound at the front of the throat, thought to be a bullet's entry. They see basically two holes. He's lying on his back face up. They see a hole at the side of the necktie knot. They see another hole in the right rear of the head. They think the hole in the necktie knot's an entry. They think the one in the right rear is an exit. And they speculate among themselves at the time and in the day following that either a bullet went in here and lodged in the lung and another bullet entered somewhere on the head and blew out the rear, or maybe one bullet entered here, climbed the spinal column somehow. We know this didn't happen because of the Zapruder film, and blew out the back of the head. The film shows us there's two separate events, that these wounds are unrelated. They're not the same bullet, and that's what they thought. The body does not look that way at the time it arrives at Bethesda that night and when the autopsy is performed. This wound, I can talk about the changes if you want to talk about the changes. Okay, let's take a look. I'm no expert, but I've seen the photographs, the drawings, the x-rays, and nothing seems to match. Mm-hmm. The x-rays don't match the pictures, don't match the drawings. We've got some over here. Maybe you can sort of comment. Okay. Anybody just jump in. All right, this is what purports to be the wound coming through the back of the neck and a photograph. In the upper left, you have their insert there showing the Warren Commission view of the neck trajectory in the back of the neck, out the front of the neck. And the autopsy photograph on the right showing the little wound at point 1 there that no one saw at Parkland Memorial Hospital. And one of the doctors actually ran his hands up the back, and he said when questioned that he didn't know about any wound. Mm-hmm. Now, 9 years later, someone's come forward and said, oh, I was told about this wound. But the bottom line is that that's the neck trajectory, and at Dallas, they thought it entered from the front. At Bethesda, they thought it entered from the rear. And regarding that wound number 1, the Dallas doctor who did the tracheotomy, Dr. Perry, received a call from Commander Humes the morning after the assassination, and he was asked by Humes, did you make any wounds in the back? Mm-hmm. And that's just a fact of the record. And he was very confused by the call and was amazed that the doctor at Bethesda said to him that there was nothing left of the throat wound. All right, this is the x-ray, purports to be the x-ray on the left, and the actual head wound, out of deference to the president, we've blanked out his face. Photograph from the autopsy. They don't seem to be the same thing. They're not. The wound in the x-ray shows a great deal of damage to the right orbit in the area in front of the, just above the eye. The photograph, however, shows no damage there at all. Not only do the wounds in the x-ray and the photographs not match each other, but neither of them match what any of the doctors saw. Mm-hmm. What was said before is absolutely true. The doctors all described, every single one of them, a large exit wound in the rear of the president's head. They said it on the day of the assassination, and they're saying it now. The photographs and x-rays do not match each other. Something is clearly wrong. And the drawings clearly don't...
One more detail about when the Assassinations Committee of the U.S. Congress looked at this stuff in 1977, 78, they made a final report acting as if they thought there was a big hole in the front right of the president's head. And nobody saw anything like that in 1963. This is a drawing on the right of the president's head, the photograph on the left. They clearly don't match. Well, the problem there is, and this is, I remember I made a discovery just like this, and what happened here was you have the doc's drawing on the right showing a clearly delineated entry wound at the rear of the head, and yet the photograph in the same area doesn't show the wound. And if there was a new investigation, I'd sure like to find out why the artist drew in a wound, in effect, that was practically in italics when the photograph doesn't show. Okay. What we have here is the area they're calling a wound. There is no definition to it. There's no depth and there's no margin. There's hair growing out of it. All it is a piece of dried blood. What happens to the president's body? He leaves Parkland in a bronze casket. He's loaded onto Air Force One, ends up in Washington, D.C. now. What happens then? Well, what happens then is the president's body is brought to Parkland Memorial Hospital. You want to talk about the evidence of the intercept? Now it's leaving Dallas. It's now on Air Force One. It is. The president's body is put into the large casket. Is put on Air Force One. Now,
Then the plane makes the flight to Washington. In Washington, the coffin is offloaded off Air Force One on national television. To pick up the story of what must have happened earlier than the day, you have to go to the witnesses who received the body. Paul O'Connor in the autopsy room gets the body in a body bag. That's in the House Select Committee's report. The body was not put in a body bag in Dallas. It was wrapped in sheets. When that report, when I made that discovery at the time, my book, Best Evidence, was about to go to Macmillan, and I had to stop publication of the book and go back to the record, because there the House report was publishing the fact that the body arrived in a body bag. And I called up the attorney for the House Select Committee and said, did Paul O'Connor say the body was in a body bag? And he said, if I wrote body bag, he said body bag. I said, Andy, his name was Andrew Purdy, do you know what a body bag is? And he said, no, what's a body bag? And I said, where were you during the Vietnam War? I mean, that's the kind of investigation they conducted, that they had the evidence, circumstantial evidence of an intercept, and they didn't even know what it looked like.
Speculation seems to be that the president was in fact loaded off the other side of the plane and perhaps airlifted to Walter Reed Hospital before it went to Bethesda?
That's correct. In Best Evidence, in Chapter 31, I analyzed the audio tapes and showed that the only possible explanation for why you have the body arriving at at Bethesda Hospital in one coffin, a coffin which must have been empty if the body was not, was arrived in a body bag, and in a different coffin, was that something took place on the starboard side of the plane. And I show the radio transmissions, which I spell out in my Chapter 31, how they're talking about going to Walter Reed first. Now, I personally today, in 1991, don't think they went to Walter Reed. There's some other stuff I'm working on. But the fact is that they're talking Walter Reed, and they're talking about a ramp on the starboard side of the plane, and one of them says on the radio, we're going to bring the First Lady off by that route.
Okay, we'll pick up where we left off in a minute after this.
They say anything about there being no brain in the...
Well, the comment was made that the brain was removed. But to my best knowledge, I don't remember seeing any saw cuts or any knife cuts. But it's not saying that it couldn't have been removed.
Did you question the purpose of the x-rays you were taking?
Yes, I asked, I said, what's the sense of taking the x-rays if there's nothing there? He said, well, that's not for you to say. You go ahead and do them.
We're back. The assassination of John F. Kennedy. Clearly a lot of strange stuff was going on around this autopsy. We have one more set of slides, Robert, which you reminded me that we have. We can put them up now. Drawing.
Very simply what this is, on the left is the drawing made for the House Assassinations Committee by Ida Docks. It purports to show the rear of the head virtually intact with the added entrance wound near the cowlick area. When we were writing High Treason, we brought these two drawings, the one on the left from the House Committee and the one on the right, which was done by Dr. Robert McClellan, one of the Dallas doctors. We showed this to 18 of the medical witnesses in Dallas, and every single one of them picked the one on the right, done by Dr. McClellan, as being accurate, depicting the president's head wound. And the one, they all said that the one on the left was not an accurate representation. The House Assassinations Committee report that no shot struck the president from the front was based entirely on the autopsy photographs.
We should maybe make the technical point here for people who don't know it, is that entrance wounds are typically small and exit wounds are big. So if you see the big hole on the back of the head, that implies the shot came from the front.
Bullets tend to flatten out as they pass through a body, tearing a larger hole as they exit. And since we're talking about...
They push a lot of mass along with it, too.
Yes, a shock wave in a sense.
Exactly.
Since we're talking about bullets here, and I know I'm moving along at a fast clip, let's touch on the single bullet theory at this point. I want to start talking about conspiracy and cover-up and the seeming stupidity of the Warren Commission, for lack of a better word. There was a pristine bullet found on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital, purported to be on Connolly's stretcher. That was the bullet that was meant to have passed through President Kennedy, made a rather odd right turn, and then came around again and struck Connolly under the armpit, passed through his chest, shattered his wrist, and ended up lodged in his thigh.
Exactly.
Now, that bullet had not a scratch on it.
Well, the thing is, with the magic bullet, if you give the nature of the known wounds and the timing that we see in the Zapruder film, this has to be the flight path. The bullet strikes the president in the back, leaving a wound of entrance 6 inches below the point where it hit. It exits the throat, leaving a small, neat wound of entrance. Stops, waits in midair for 1.6 seconds, heads upward and to the right, apparently sees Governor Connolly and says, why not? Makes a sharp downward left-hand turn, hits Governor Connolly by the right armpit, fracturing the fifth rib, knocking out a 3-inch section, causing secondary missiles of bone to flatten and basically almost destroy his right lung. The bullet exits the right side of his chest, leaving a wound the size of an old-style silver dollar. Heading again right to left, sees Governor Connolly's wrist to the right, and again says, why not? Makes a right-hand turn, fractures the distal radius bone, one of the densest bones in Governor Connolly's body. Now it's heading out toward the grassy knoll, but then sees his left leg and makes a sharp U-turn. Buries itself in his left thigh, where it remains until it's surgically removed hours after the single bullet's on its way back to Washington.
If nothing else about the Warren Commission report is ridiculous, the single bullet theory is. And that seems to me the linchpin of the Warren Commission. If you don't believe that,
it all falls.
Then the whole thing falls apart, and Oswald cannot have been the only assassin if he was, in fact, in the 6th floor of the school book depository building at all.
Now, the Select Committee in the House tried to solve this problem by figuring out a faster way to fire the rifle. They decided if you didn't aim it, you could maybe get a shot off in something like 1.7 or 8 seconds, which is still too slow for that time interval. But it was on this assumption that, well, that raises all kinds of other questions.
Certainly raises a lot of questions. Who put that bullet on the stretcher, for one? It certainly wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, who was somewhere else.
Well, the point is that if you have a body alteration plot, then planting ammunition in connection with a plan to alter the body makes perfect sense. If you don't have a body alteration plot, then you are playing at deuces wild, because if you plant a bullet, how are you going to know it's going to fit into the pattern of the wounding? So the only way the planted bullet makes sense is the idea that you are going to create a false impact situation, that you can punch a hole and plant a bullet. But the point that Carl made during the break was that all of this sounds all technical and mechanical. The importance of all of this is that it has a political implication. And that is, once you get away from the lone assassin theory, you get into the question. The reason the commission concluded one man did this and put the puzzle together this way is that they had too many wounds and not enough ammunition. Now, once you do it any other way, you start to question the evidence. And as soon as you question the evidence, whether it's a bullet, a body, or a coffin, or anything like that, you get into who's pulling strings, who's lowering camouflage over the event at the time or within hours of the shooting. And that gets real serious. And that's why there's a direct connection between the analysis of the shooting, which evidence was falsified, and what line of authority was used to phony it.
Okay. In addition to that, another bullet was signed for at the autopsy. It was found by an admiral, handed over to the autopsist, who handed it over to the FBI. Siebert and O'Neill, the two agents, signed for it for a full missile recovered. That has never been placed into evidence, so we don't know what happened to it or where from the president's body it was removed.
Okay, we have to take another break right now. When we come back, conspiracy, cover-up, etc. in a minute. We're talking about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy with my guests from Esquire magazine, Robert Sam Anson, the author of Best Evidence, David Lifton, and authority on the political aspects of the JFK assassination, Carl Oglesby, and photo researcher Robert Groden. It would seem, gentlemen, that we have a conspiracy here. Who, why, how?
Well, I think one of the key ways of getting at this is to examine the assassination just the way the ordinary homicide cops do a murder. Who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to pull it off, and who had the wherewithal to cover it up. We've established, I think, fairly convincingly, but something rotten was going on with the autopsy. That was conducted under U.S. government auspices. We've also established, I think, fairly convincingly that Oswald had a relationship with U.S. intelligence. Does that mean that U.S. intelligence was involved in the assassination? Not necessarily. The fact of the matter is, though, that the government is somehow involved. And it has to be involved because these are the folks who had the wherewithal to cover this thing up. So then you've got to ask yourself, why would they do it? Now, I think we get sometimes too hung up on the details of how this thing worked. The fact of the matter is that however many people were involved, it did work. And why did they? John Kennedy certainly had plenty of enemies out there, but very few of them had the power to cover this thing up. And I think, personally, I've come to the view that the answer to this lies in Vietnam. And it has been a myth for a long time, but nothing changed in Vietnam because of the assassination, and I think that...
Carl, we're kind of wandering into your territory here.
Well, it's everybody's territory, actually, and the fact is this is the part of the case that's most available to ordinary information. You don't have to be an expert on bullet wounds to find out that something very serious changed in American foreign policy with the death of Kennedy and the advent of Johnson. Kennedy was trying to make some kind of peace with Castro. He was internally trying to make some kind of peace with the civil rights movement, which earned him lots of enemies in the South in particular. The Castro bid, by the way, made him a target for the anti-Castro Cuban community, the exiles who had flooded into the country after the victory of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and who thought that they had a supporter in Kennedy, who believed that they would be able ultimately to mount an invasion on Castro's Cuba from the United States, overthrow Castro, and reestablish the system that had existed before, the system in which the mafia had controlled the casinos and so on. And in respect to Vietnam, it seems clear that Kennedy had decided sometime in the summer of 1963 that the United States simply could not invest more troops, more material, more money in the attempt to prop up a hated regime in the south of the country. And having tried to a certain degree to achieve certain results, and having failed to achieve those results, now he was going to pull away. This made a lot of people angry with him, too. There were a lot of folks who thought that we needed to fight that war in Vietnam.
And it's not just speculation. There are top-secret documents that have been declassified that come from the White House, National Security Action Memorandums, that confirm that President Kennedy, 6 weeks before his death, had secretly ordered the first withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. combat advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963, and that they were all to follow by mid-year, I believe, of 1965. Now, that happened 6 weeks before his death. Then on November 20th, 1963, 48 hours before the assassination, the military calls for a massive buildup in Vietnam at a conference in Honolulu. Then on November 26th, when we have a new president in office, Lyndon Johnson, he approves escalatory steps and he cancels the withdrawal from Vietnam.
Can we put any
Now that is documented, but this is not just speculation from far-out, crazy, paranoid people. This stuff is on black and white in documents, and there is no question about it. Policy was turned on its head because of the assassination.
Well, Robert,
it was interesting that Allen Dulles, who Kennedy has fired as head of the CIA, was the head of the Warren Commission investigating his assassination.
Well, there's no excuse that he was made a member of the Warren Commission.
Not only is this all documented, Robert's being very modest here. His magazine story, in fact, breaks new ground journalistically and reveals for the first time the existence of a major study which is going to be published in January, and by an Army officer and a PhD candidate who's probably going to get his PhD within days or weeks on this topic. And the book is going to be called JFK in Vietnam, and Robert interviewed him extensively and knows all about this. And the first information from this manuscript, and I'm proud to have been one of about 4 readers of this manuscript because the author's a close friend of mine, is John Newman. And I hope you have him on your show when his book is published.
We'd love to. Is there any evidence that the Mafia was involved in this in any way?
The Mafia may have been involved, but we have to remember always that the Mafia was in a contractual relationship with the CIA in the period 1960 to 1963.
And certainly very involved with Cuba. They wanted their casinos back.
Yes, absolutely. And the CIA peculiarly had turned to the Mafia in what came to be known as Operation Mongoose, and wanted to use Mafia hitmen to destroy Castro, Raul Castro, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, Che Guevara, other Cuban leaders. And there is a large body of opinion that thinks that the assassination team that had been prepared to blow Castro away was turned around against Kennedy himself after it became clear that Kennedy was going to put a stop to these shenanigans against Castro.
Well, I got to take a break. We'll pick up where we left off in just a minute.
Need a smoke.
We're back with our discussion of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Jack Ruby, Oswald's murderer, is an odd figure in all this. Where does he fit in?
He's absolutely crucial. If Ruby hadn't bumped Oswald off 2 days after Dealey Plaza, Oswald would have had the opportunity to stand